In late 1950, American bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons were quietly moved into position. At the same time, Soviet pilots officially not even part of the war were already fighting U.S. aircraft over Korea. Both sides had nuclear weapons. Both sides were testing limits. And the only thing stopping a nuclear exchange was restraint that almost failed. The world came closer than most people realized to a conflict that would have changed everything. The Korean War didn't begin as a global conflict, but it was never just a civil war either. In June of 1950, North Korea invaded the South. To Washington, this wasn't only about Korea. It was about containment, the strategy meant to stop communism from spreading. The timing was critical. The Soviet Union had just tested its first atomic bomb. China had recently become communist. And the United States no longer held a monopoly on nuclear weapons. The world had entered a new, terrifying age. Every move in Korea felt like a signal to the entire world, and every signal carried global consequences. For the first time, a regional war had the potential to ignite a worldwide nuclear catastrophe. At first, U.S. and United Nations forces pushed North Korean troops back with stunning success. The amphibious landing at Incheon was a masterpiece of military strategy, and it seemed like the war might be over quickly. But everything changed in late 1950 when Chinese forces crossed into the war in massive numbers. Suddenly, American troops were in a desperate retreat through freezing conditions, facing a new and formidable enemy. And General Douglas MacArthur, the celebrated commander of UN forces, believed the solution was escalation. MacArthur openly proposed using nuclear weapons. He wasn't talking about a single strike. He envisioned a series of atomic bombs, aimed at Chinese supply lines and border crossings. He believed that nuclear weapons could end the war quickly and decisively. President Harry Truman, however, believed they could start the next one. The two men were on a collision course. Truman saw Korea as a limited war, one that had to be contained to prevent a much larger conflict with the Soviet Union and China. MacArthur saw it as a battle that had to be won at any cost, even if that cost was nuclear. The disagreement wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was a fundamental clash over the future of warfare and the world itself. Then came the sentence that shook the world. At a press conference, when asked if the United States would use atomic weapons in Korea, President Truman said the option was under active consideration. That was all it took. The stock markets reacted. America's allies panicked, fearing they would be dragged into a nuclear war. And behind the scenes, something even more alarming was happening. Nuclear-capable bombers were quietly repositioned, moving closer to their potential targets. There was no public declaration, no announcement, just preparation. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see if the active consideration would become active reality. It was a moment of extreme tension, where a single decision could have led to unimaginable destruction. While nuclear weapons dominated strategy rooms, something else was happening high above Korea in a secret war in the sky. Soviet pilots were flying combat missions. They flew advanced MiG-15 jets. And they fought American pilots directly in the skies over an area that became known as MiG Alley. These pilots were ordered never to be captured. They spoke Korean or Chinese over the radio to hide their identities. They avoided flying too far south, where they might be shot down and their presence revealed. Officially, they did not exist. Both the United States and the Soviet Union publicly denied that their forces were in direct combat. But the pilots knew the truth. American and Soviet forces were killing each other in open combat, turning the Korean War into a direct, albeit secret, confrontation between the world's two superpowers. Joseph Stalin had no desire for an open war with the United States, but he feared something worse: nuclear first strike. He knew the Soviet Union was still behind America in nuclear capability. Stalin worried that the Korean conflict could be used by the West as a justification for a massive, preemptive attack on the USSR. So, he limited Soviet involvement, There would be no Soviet ground troops. The pilots had strict rules of engagement. Instead, China would bear most of the burden of the fighting on the ground. At the same time, Soviet nuclear development was accelerated at a frantic pace. Both sides were preparing for the worst while trying desperately to avoid it. It was a dangerous paradox, building up arsenals for a war that nobody wanted to fight. In April of 1951, President Truman made a decision that changed the course of the war and possibly the world. He fired General Douglas MacArthur. The General's public calls for expanding the war and using nuclear weapons had become too much for Truman to ignore. The firing sent a clear message to the world. The United States would fight in Korea, but it would not risk a nuclear war to win it. With MacArthur gone, the strategy of escalation was taken off the table. The front lines eventually stabilized around the 38th parallel, and the war dragged on into a bloody stalemate for another 2 years. But the most important outcome was what didn't happen. The nuclear weapons stayed unused. The step back from the brink had worked. The Korean War never officially ended. An armistice was signed, but a formal peace treaty never was. But the conflict taught the Cold War its first hard lesson. How close was too close. It established a terrifying precedent for how superpowers could fight proxy wars without triggering a global apocalypse. Because just years later, the United States and the Soviet Union would face each other again. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, this time with nuclear missiles pointed directly at their cities. And the margin for error would be easy. The lessons learned in the skies and strategy rooms of the Korean War would be put to the ultimate test. Thanks for watching. If you found this look into history interesting, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about the moments that shaped our world. See you next time.